Ever wonder what happens when a TV show goes horribly, terribly wrong? From bizarre talking cars to shows that tore marriages apart on live television, here are the 35 worst TV shows that officially ended after taking a turn for the worse. Number 35. My Mother the Car. Have you ever heard of a show where your mom literally comes back as a car? Well, this happened. During its brief run from 1965 to 1966, My Mother the Car aired on NBC with 30 episodes. The show follows a man whose late mother is reincarnated as a car, chatting with him through the radio. Yes, you did in fact hear that right. Despite a seasoned production team and starring Jerry Van Dyke, it faced harsh criticism, even being labeled the second worst show ever by TV Guide, barely beating out the Jerry Springer Show. Like other fantasy comedies of its time, such as Bewitched and I Dream of Genie, it relied on a whimsical premise. It was a bit too much for audiences to enjoy. Number 34. Three's a Crowd. Think you've seen some sleazy game shows? Wait till you hear about this one that pitted a wife against a secretary. Don't mistake this show with Three's Company or the 1980s Three's a Crowd TV show. This 70s disaster is something completely different. This was a sleazy game show where a guy would see who knew him the best, his wife or his secretary. Unlike other shows that bring people together, this one was destined to tear marriages apart. Nothing like watching marriages dissolve right before your eyes. The scary thing was that the show came back in 1999 on the Game Show Network, although this one focused on girlfriends and best friends. It also bombed. Number 33. Rowan and Martin's Laughin. Once a smash hit, but how did it turn from a groundbreaking show into something unwatchable? Let's find out. We can admit that this show was funny and well loved at the time of its airing. It went on to have many seasons that it wasn't even supposed to have at the beginning. It was only supposed to be a one-time special, but it was so successful that it blew up. It was hosted by veteran comedians Dan Rowan and Dick Martin, playing the straight man and the dummy, respectively. The show relied largely on young, emerging talents such as Goldie Hawn, Gary Owens, Artie Johnson, Ruth Bootsy, and Henry Gibson, who quickly became household names. The regular performers frequently reprised characters and gave rise to punchlines that became ubiquitous. You bet your sweet Bippy, here come to judge, very interesting, and sock it to me. Its humor helped pave the way for current culture humor, including classics like Seinfeld, but if you watch it again, you just have to gawk at how unfunny it is. The humor does not age well, and maybe young kids might still find it funny, but this Laughin does not bring us any more laughs. Number 32. Hogans Heroes. What happens when you turn a Nazi POW camp into a comedy? It gets weird real fast. Here's the truth. Hogans Heroes is a popular television series that aired on CBS from 1965 to 1971. The series, which starred Bob Crane as Colonel Robert Hogan, is set at Stalag 13, a German prisoner of war camp for Western Allies prisoners during World War II. In the series plot, Stalag 13 is a Luftstalag located near the village of Hammelburg, run by the German Air Force, Luftwaffe, for Allied Air Forces personnel. The prisoners, in turn, run an anti-Nazi organization beneath the camp right under the Germans' noses. Hogans Heroes may have been a fun and entertaining show, but you can't deny that it seems a bit odd that they made Nazis look like fun and lovable people at a time when they were too recently dethroned as some of the most dangerous people in the world. To make it even worse, some of the actors who played the Nazis were Jewish, and a few had even escaped Nazi Germany themselves. One of them was even imprisoned for 3 years. They were okay with it though for some reason, but others quit after only a short while because they just couldn't take it anymore. Yikes. Number 31. David Cassidy, Man Undercover. David Cassidy as a tough, undercover cop? Sounds strange, right? You won't believe how badly this turned out. In his first starring role since The Partridge Family, David Cassidy played an undercover cop who poses as a student to investigate a high school drug ring. It all sounds very 21 Jump Street, but the show was apparently bombed pretty hard. It was weird off the bat because David Cassidy played this tough guy, which didn't fit him at all. The acting from the other characters is also pretty weak. After 10 episodes, NBC decided that it wasn't worth continuing. Number 30. The Ropers. Three's Company was a hit, so this spin-off should have been too, right? Think again. Here's why it failed. Three's Company was a huge hit, so ABC created a spin-off called The Ropers. It attempted to capitalize on the enormous success of the original, but failed to realize one thing. The Ropers weren't likable enough for people to watch it. The characters weren't funny or interesting, so audiences stopped watching. The show did have 2 seasons, which consisted of 28 episodes. In the late 80s, a spin-off for the spin-off was pitched, but it was pulled because there were too many sitcoms at the time. Number 29. Who's Watching the Kids? 2 Vegas showgirls babysitting their siblings? Sounds wild, but it was a disaster. Let's dig into why it flopped. Producer Gary Marshall, for some reason, kept going back to an idea of Vegas showgirls. This one was about 2 young Las Vegas showgirls working together while watching their younger siblings. That's it. Them sharing their lives together. Riveting plot idea, right? The original pilot did well, but the rest of the series did not, and the following episodes failed to garner sufficient viewership. Who's Watching the Kids was set to have 15 episodes, but they made it through 9 before NBC canceled it. Number 28. Mr. Ed. We've seen talking animals before, but this talking horse show? It's more weird and creepy than you'd expect. Again with the weird premises. A talking horse? Audiences might have loved this show, but you have to admit that it was also kinda creepy and super weird. If a horse could only talk to one person, did that make the horse have the ability to talk? Or does it make the human crazy for seeing such hallucinations and need a visit to a psychologist? Either way, this might have been exciting to children, but to adults, there was just something odd going on that made us not want to watch. Number 27. The Tammy Grimes Show. A Broadway star in her own sitcom sounds promising, right? But this one bombed quicker than anyone expected. This sitcom was so bad that it was canceled after only 4 episodes. This was pretty uncommon for the networks to do in those days because they usually wanted a show to run a fuller course before determining if it was good or not. But not with the Tammy Grimes Show. Audiences just did not like it. Tammy Grimes was a famous Broadway actress, and her talents just did not translate onto the TV screen. She was best live, and the show was best unaired. Number 26. The Jackie Gleason Show. Jackie Gleason was a comedy legend, but even he couldn't save this show from its awkward downfall. Here's why. The Jackie Gleason Show was a series of TV shows aired on the CBS network, starring comedian-actor Jackie Gleason. Originally, the show aired on the Dumont network under the name Cavalcade of Stars from June 4, 1949 to September 26, 1952. In 1952, Gleason was given a considerably higher salary and it was renamed The Jackie Gleason Show. After Jackie Gleason's attempt at You're in the Picture fell flat on its face, he revamped the show to instead be The Jackie Gleason Show in a more variety show type of way. It did well with ratings over the years, but that quickly became short-lived. A lot of the funniest jokes the show revolved around the weight of the people on the show, but once they lost a lot of weight after being on a diet, they lost a lot of their ratings, leading to an eventual cancellation. If your show revolves around making jokes of how someone looks so much so that when they start to change their looks it kills your show, it probably wasn't that good of a show to start with. Number 25. The Patty Duke Show. Identical cousins? Sounds impossible because it is. This weird premise didn't sit right with viewers who knew basic biology. Let's talk about science for a second. A man and a woman have a baby, and the woman's sister and her husband also have a baby. The first couple will have a child with their genes, while the other couple will have a child with their own separate genes. These children will be cousins and in no way, shape, or form have the same genes. Then, why did the Patty Duke Show think it was okay to make a show that was completely scientifically impossible and just weird as to make the main characters identical cousins? It might have been a cute and fun show, but if you had any idea of how science works, you just didn't enjoy the show because of how scientifically inaccurate it was. No doubt that it probably led thousands of children to believe that something like this was possible. It's not even possible if both sets of parents were identical twin siblings. Number 24. The Beverly Hillbillies. Stereotypes galore. This show made rural folks the butt of every joke, and critics couldn't stand it. Critics absolutely hated this show, and we think for good reason. It's just a bunch of stereotypical nonsense that made Southerners and people from rural America look bad. Sure, the characters were lovable, but they were portrayed as both lovable and the brunt of many jokes. Jokes, by the way, that the critics did not find funny at all. The family often made meals like a possum stew in their big Beverly Hills mansion, and we were supposed to find that funny. They didn't get any laughs from us. Number 23. The Second 100 Years. A man frozen in ice for decades suddenly reappears in the 60s? Great idea, but the execution, not so much. The show ran straight into the ground in the first season. It did not have good ratings at the beginning, and they just got worse and worse over the course of the 30 episodes that aired. If you don't remember it, which you probably don't, its story was centered around a man who was frozen in an avalanche in 1900, which preserved his body in its whole state until he was thawed in 1967 and met his now elderly son, and was confused by all of the changes that happened in almost 70 years. It could have been good, but it just wasn't and didn't last. Number 22. The Phyllis Diller Show. It got a last-ditch name change to save it, but even Phyllis Diller couldn't make this one a success. The Phyllis Diller Show was not always named The Phyllis Diller Show. It was originally The Pruitts of Southampton, and it did not do well, so they renamed it after the leading actress who was pretty popular at the time. It was obviously not a great show, though, because the name change couldn't save the dying show, and it croaked before it could get a second season. This sitcom was definitely not a memorable one from the 60s. Number 21. Gemini Man. Invisible agents and secret missions? Sounds thrilling, right? But this show turned invisible faster than its lead character. Gemini Man had a pretty good premise to go off of. Based on H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, this series followed a secret agent who could become invisible thanks to his exposure to radiation. So, what happened? It was just awful. It was so bad that the Mystery Science Theater had an episode about it. No one's really sure whether it was the writing or the actors to blame for its cancellation. Gemini Man had 11 episodes made, but only 5 were aired. Number 20. My Three Sons. This classic show ran forever, but was it really any good? Spoiler, it wasn't as loved as you'd think. My Three Sons ran on TV for a very long time, but that did not make it a good show. It never even got into the top 10 for ratings. It's a very clean show with not a lot of interest, and they switched out characters like it was no big deal. Why couldn't they keep some of the main actors on the show anyway? Number 19. Leave It to Beaver. The perfect family is always the most boring, right? Leave It to Beaver is proof that perfection doesn't sell. Here we go again with the boring, stereotypical perfect family. What's so special about having a perfect family anyway? It looks rather mundane if you ask us. There's no intrigue or interest, just the same thing over and over again. The utopia that was the show Leave It to Beaver had everyone longing for a simple life just as this, but we'd rather have our messy, chaotic lives, thank you very much. Number 18. The Brady Bunch. A perfectly blended family with zero problems? This show was more fantasy than reality, and viewers weren't buying it. The Brady Bunch first aired in 1969 after a woman's husband and a man's wife allegedly died. Then, the two living spouses married, and their families mixed seamlessly together to create a perfectly blended family with no mention of the children's dead parents or the parents' deceased spouses. This was completely unrealistic. Though the show was panned by critics and largely ignored by audiences during its network run, it became wildly popular in reruns, and its namesake family has come to represent the embodiment of the quaint, wholesome, middle-class American family. Sure, the Brady Bunch is beloved by many, but we have to all agree that it was just way too polished and unrealistic, a problem many shows in the 60s had. There had to be some negativity buried deep inside that family somewhere. Number 17. Dennis the Menace. Another comic strip turned TV show, but did this naughty kid translate well to the small screen? Not really. Dennis the Menace is an American sitcom based on the Hank Ketchum comic strip of the same name. It preceded The Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday evenings on CBS from October 4, 1959 to July 7, 1963. The series stars Jay North as Dennis Mitchell, Herbert Anderson as his father, Henry, Gloria Henry as his mother, Alice, Joseph Kearns as George Wilson, Gail Gordon as George's brother, John Wilson, Sylvia Field as George's wife, Martha Wilson, and Sarah Seeger as John's wife, Eloise Wilson. Another comic strip turned into a full-blown TV series and, according to many, it doesn't translate over well. It was simple-minded, and the producers didn't have much content to work from based on just a short comic strip. Also, can we just talk about how horrible Dennis was and how his parents rarely ever got on to him? This was just bad parenting. And in addition to Dennis annoying everyone on the show, he ended up annoying the audience as well. For some reason, people actually liked this show. We don't know why. Number 16. Penco Junction. Beverly Hillbillies spin-off, but worse. Ever heard of women bathing in drinking water? This show got gross real fast. This show was a spin-off of the Beverly Hillbillies, and it just wasn't any better. In fact, it was probably worse. It still had those weird stereotypes that the Beverly Hillbillies had, and more. Penco Junction is an American television sitcom that originally aired on CBS from September 1963 to April 1970. The series takes place at the Shady Rest Hotel, which is run by Kate Bradley, her three daughters Billy Jo, Bobby Jo, and Betty Jo, and her uncle Joe Carson. The series is one of 3 interrelated shows about rural characters produced by Paul Henning. It was just gross when the women bathed in the water tower as well. People drank that water, and they were just too dumb to realize that? Still offensive and even worse than the Beverly Hillbillies. Number 15. Turn On. Cancelled during its first episode airing. Yes, it was that bad. Here's how Turn On became TV's biggest joke. One of the biggest flops in TV history, Turn On only aired for 1 episode before it was cancelled. It was a sketch comedy show, much like Saturday Night Live, but unlike Saturday Night Live, it only got 1/20th of a season instead of well over 40 seasons. According to Tim Conway in an interview with PBS, Turn On was being cancelled as it was airing for the first time across the country, so by the time it reached California, it was more like a turn off. He claims that it was because it was too ahead of its time, but who knows if it would have even made it later on. Number 14. Sword of Justice. A playboy by day, mercenary by night. Sounds like Batman, but trust us, it's nothing like that. In this TV series, a playboy by day is a mercenary by night. But this is no Batman tale. To leave messages and warnings for criminals, he would place a 3 card of the 4 various suits denoting a specific meaning. Does this sound a little odd? Yeah, we thought so too. Apparently, audiences weren't too enthused on the idea and no one tuned in. The series aired 9 episodes in total before NBC pulled the plug. Number 13. Donna Reed Show. A groundbreaking show for women, but did it just reverse the roles instead of changing them? Here's the catch. This show broke through many barriers of misogyny at a time when women were seen as meek and mild housewives, but at what cost? Donna was a strong mother who knew how to do everything and solved all of the problems that came their way. She could fulfill the role of mother and father and didn't need no man. Except for the fact that she was married and had children with this man. She might have been strong and independent, but in the process, she demeaned her husband, which is basically a role reversal of the stereotype of the time. This didn't mean that the man and woman were equal, but that one had to be less than the other for the other to be valued. It's not as groundbreaking of a show as people say. Number 12. You're in the Picture. One of the biggest TV flops ever. It was so bad Jackie Gleason actually apologized on air. Here's why. You're in the Picture was one of the biggest flops in television history, pretty close to Turn On. It was a game show run by Jackie Gleason, and it only aired for technically 2 episodes. one planned episode, and one time slot filler of Jackie Gleason apologizing for how bad the first episode was. Yikes. It had to be horrible for someone who clearly believed in it enough to produce and broadcast it on national television to issue such a quick apology. Number 11. Mrs. Columbo. A spin-off of the beloved Columbo, but this one just didn't feel right at all. What went wrong? Let's see. Columbo was a great series, so the network wanted to create a spin-off. Even though Mrs. Columbo had a high production value, the characters just didn't feel right. It was to the point where it felt miscast. As if that weren't enough to go wrong with the show, the writing felt forced. The final nail in the coffin was the pace, which was so dull that it felt formulaic. It was nothing the original was, and that's why audiences bailed after just 13 episodes. Number 10. The Ugliest Girl in Town. Cross-dressing gone wrong. This show offended nearly everyone and didn't last long. Here's the baffling premise. This show is not only one of the worst of the 60s, but also of all time. Critics said it was distasteful then, and we say it's still distasteful now. The premise of a man who people confused as a woman and then pretended to be a female model in London was just confusing and offensive to so many people. The Ugliest Girl in Town would definitely not fly nowadays, and it barely even flew in the 60s. It didn't even get a full season before they canceled it for good. Number 9. Bewitched. This magical show was adored, but after a while it just became predictable and stale. What went wrong? This show may have been great and loved by many for several seasons, but after a while it just got old, predictable, and boring. It had really bad ratings towards the end, but the producers just couldn't cancel it because they were still making money off of it. This is a lesson in stopping while you're ahead, and shows like The Office, Parks and Recreation, and many other future shows should have looked to this one as an example instead of extending the seasons and making it worse. Number 8. The Andy Griffith Show. This is a classic, but let's be honest, it's also one of the most boring shows of all time. Here's why. Don't kill us, but The Andy Griffith Show has to be one of the most boring shows to ever air on TV. Watching the opening of a rerun of that show on TV was enough to cure our insomnia. We long to be the rock that Opie threw in the water at the beginning of every episode because we know that rock didn't have to listen to the droning dialogue. Sure, the show taught great life lessons and many consider it a classic, but that's only if you can stay awake long enough to watch it. Every episode also had the same plotline repeated over and over. Talk about being predictable. Number 7. Adam's Rib. Based on a famous movie, but the TV version didn't stand a chance. Here's how this courtroom drama crashed. Based on a 1949 film, Adam's Rib featured a DA husband who crossed paths with his lawyer wife in the courtroom. The show didn't connect with audiences, and it only made it to December after a fall premiere. There's no denying that Adam's Rib was an unqualified flop. Fun fact, the show starred a young Blythe Danner who would go on to have later success in projects like Meet the Parents and Will and Grace. At least something came out of Adam's Rib.
I was just wondering.
Number 6. Flying High. A show about flight attendants trying to be sexy and adventurous? It tanked quickly. Let's see why. Flying High had an obviously great premise of following the lives of 3 sexy flight attendants. Can you tell our sarcasm? That description is not a great sign. Naturally, audiences weren't interested in a show that sounds more like an adult film. The writing was beyond stereotypical and received poor reviews. It was obvious the show was trying to create something Charlie's Angels-esque, but it was just awful. Somehow it lasted 15 episodes, but there were 3 others that weren't aired. Number 5. The Flying Nun. A nun who flies because of her headwear. This ridiculous premise surprisingly lasted 3 seasons. Here's why. Okay, this show is just ridiculous. We can't even believe it made it from 1967 to 1970. In this show, we're supposed to believe that a nun could fly because she was lightweight and properly proportioned and wore a coronet that made her very aerodynamic, and the oceanside hills of Puerto Rico solved problems by simply being able to fly. That's a tough one. Maybe this concept could have been made better by making the nun have supernatural powers and having her deal with that while being in the Catholic Church, but maybe that would have been too controversial. Instead, we had to believe that physics works in a way that makes her fly, when we all know that physics, in fact, does not work that way. Number 4. The Addams Family. Iconic but corny. This spooky family might be a classic, but it's not without its cringe. Let's look closer. Talk about predictable and corny. The Addams Family had all of it. Sure, kids loved it, but kids also loved Teletubbies. It was super cheesy, and all of the jokes were the same, all focused on how they just didn't like the light and wanted to be in the dark. If monsters like these actually existed, they would probably be offended by how simple they made them look on this show. It may be a classic and a favorite, but it does not hold up unless you can recall those feelings you had while watching it as a young child. Number 3. I Dream of Genie. A 2,000-year-old genie who calls her future husband Master? This beloved show was weird on so many levels. Viewers may have loved this show at the time, but you can't deny how weird it was that this man, Genie called Master, was eventually her husband. As you probably know, Genie was a 2,000-year-old genie in a bottle, and whoever found the bottle was her master. So Genie called this man Master, fell in love with him, and the two eventually got married. It might have been cute as you were watching it, but it's just pretty bad if you think about it, especially from the man's perspective. He kept Genie in a bottle wherever he went and then married her. I mean, he did eventually free her, but it's a little bit of creepy patriarchy that wouldn't have been popular on today's TV stations. Number 2. Gilligans Island. Stranded on an island but can't build a boat, this cult favorite has some serious plot holes. Let's dive in. A cult favorite, but come on. This show was one of the worst. They just wanted to replace the monkey spot after it went off air, and they didn't succeed. Gilligan's Island isn't the same. Also, tell us why the professor was able to make all of these crazy inventions, but somehow never a boat to get them off the island. Don't even get us started on how the girls always had makeup on, or the way they portrayed the indigenous people. That's definitely not cool. Number 1. My Favorite Martian. Aliens disguised as uncles? This show kicked off strong, but ended up being one of the worst. Let's see why. Another show banking on a trend, My Favorite Martian, piggybacked off of the supernatural theme that was popular in many TV shows of its time. In this show, a Martian who looked very human-like crash-landed on Earth, and a local scientist disguised him as his Uncle Martin. He was the only human who knew Martin's real identity. This show did well for its first season, but after the second, ratings started to drop. It was picked up for a third season in which Martin's real Martian nephew also crash-landed on Earth, but when they heard that this nephew was going to be a recurring character in the fourth season, they dropped the show. It obviously wasn't doing too hot either, if that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this trip down TV's Hall of Shame, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more crazy content. Check out our other videos for even more shocking stories from TV history. See you there!